So, this happened to me a few years ago, and to this day, I still can't fully wrap my head around it. It's easily the scariest experience of my life, and I've never really shared it in detail, but after seeing so many similar stories on here, I figured it's time. I hope writing this out helps me shake off some of the lingering fear, though honestly, I still have nightmares about it sometimes. To give you some context, I used to live in a small, sleepy town in the Midwest, one of those places where everyone knows everyone, and not much ever happens. My house was just outside of town, nestled between cornfields and a stretch of forest. It was quiet, and I loved that. I was always a bit of an introvert, and the isolation suited me. My closest neighbor was about a mile away, and that was the way I liked it. It was late fall, and the weather had started to turn. We were in the middle of a big storm, one of those really intense ones with pouring rain, thunder shaking the house, and the wind howling so loudly you could barely hear anything else. I've always loved storms, so I wasn't too concerned. I had the fireplace going, a good book in hand, and the storm raging outside was just background noise. It was probably around 11 p.m. when the power went out. I wasn't too surprised. Our power always went out during storms, and I was prepared. I grabbed a few candles and lit them, figuring I'd just head to bed early. I didn't really want to stay up too long in a dark, quiet house with nothing to do. I was halfway up the stairs when I heard it, a loud banging sound coming from the front of the house. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the storm. It sounded deliberate, like someone was hitting the front door hard. Now, you have to understand, no one ever comes to my house. Especially not during a storm in the middle of the night. I stood there for a second, frozen, trying to figure out if I had imagined it. Then the banging came again, louder this time, more insistent. I grabbed my phone, which still had a little battery left, and slowly made my way to the front door. The wind was howling, and the rain was coming down in sheets, making it hard to see anything outside through the window next to the door. I tried to tell myself it was probably just a tree branch hitting the house or some debris flying around. But then, as I got closer, I saw a shadow, someone standing just outside the door. I stopped, my hand gripping the doorknob. My mind raced. Who the hell would be out here, in the middle of a storm, pounding on my door? My first thought was that maybe someone had crashed their car or gotten lost, and they needed help. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I couldn't see them clearly, just a dark figure standing still, not moving, just waiting. Who is it? I called out, my voice shaky. No answer. Just the sound of the rain hammering the roof and the wind howling through the trees. I swallowed hard, my heart racing faster. Do you need help? Still nothing. I inched closer to the door, trying to get a better look through the window, but the figure was standing too far back, just out of the glow of the porch light. I had this creeping feeling of dread, like whoever was out there wasn't just some lost traveler or someone in need of help. They were too still, too quiet. Something about it didn't feel right. I decided to try again. I'm going to call the police if you don't answer me. As soon as I said that, the banging stopped. The silence was even worse. My entire body was on edge, every hair standing on end. I pressed my ear against the door, listening. Nothing. No footsteps, no movement. Just the storm. After a few minutes, I slowly backed away from the door, my heart still pounding. I didn't know what else to do. I felt like I couldn't just open the door, not with how weird this whole situation felt, but I didn't want to stand there all night, either. My brain was telling me to go upstairs, lock the bedroom door, and wait it out. Maybe whoever it was would leave. Just as I turned to head back upstairs, there was another knock. Not a bang this time, but a slow, deliberate knock. 3 times. Like whoever was out there wanted me to know they weren't leaving. I stopped, every muscle in my body tensing. The knocks came again. Slow. Steady. Patient. I stood there, staring at the door, my mind racing. I could call the police, but what would I say? That someone was knocking on my door in the middle of a storm? They'd probably just tell me to wait it out. Another knock. This time louder. Against my better judgment, I moved back to the door. My hand hovered over the doorknob for a second before I yanked it open just enough to see outside, keeping the chain locked. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear over it. And that's when I saw him. He was standing just a few feet from the door now, a tall man, soaked from head to toe, his face hidden under the brim of a dark, dripping hat. His clothes were old, too old, like something from another era, and his eyes. God, his eyes were so dark. They didn't seem right, like they were empty. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, staring at me, rain pouring off his coat and hat. I wanted to say something, but my throat felt dry. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I just stared back at him, frozen. After what felt like an eternity, he finally spoke. His voice was low, almost a whisper, but I could hear every word over the storm. "Let me in." I slammed the door shut, my hands shaking, and locked it as fast as I could. I stumbled back, my heart racing, my whole body trembling with fear. Who the hell was this guy? Why did he want to come in? I ran upstairs and locked myself in the bedroom, my mind racing. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my hands shaking so badly I could barely press the buttons. The operator answered, and I explained what had happened as best as I could, though I was so panicked that my words came out in a rush. They said they'd send someone out to check the area, but given the storm, it might take a while. I sat there in the dark, my back against the door, listening. And then, once again, I heard it. That slow, deliberate knock on the front door. I stayed locked in my room until the police finally showed up. They checked the property and found nothing. No footprints, no sign of anyone being there. They told me it was probably just my imagination, maybe someone passing through who had already left. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. The next morning, I found something that still haunts me. On my front door, etched into the wood, were 3 deep scratches. Like someone or something had tried to claw their way inside. I moved out of that house a few months later. I couldn't stay there after that night. I still don't know who or what that man was, but I hope I never see him again. So, to the man in the storm, the one who wanted to be let in, let's not meet. Dot. 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 I've debated sharing this for a while, but after reading so many similar stories, I figured I might as well contribute my own. This happened about 5 years ago, and it still haunts me to this day. It's the kind of experience that changes the way you see the world, how you trust people, how safe you feel even in your own home. At the time, I was living in a small apartment in a quiet suburban neighborhood. It wasn't anything special, just a modest 1-bedroom on the ground floor of a larger complex. I lived alone, and despite what happened, I had always felt pretty secure. The building had decent security, and I had never had any issues with my neighbors or the area. It was the kind of place where everyone kept to themselves, but you'd occasionally see familiar faces in the hallway or parking lot. It was midsummer, and we were going through a brutal heat wave. My apartment didn't have air conditioning, so I usually left the windows open during the evening to let in some cooler air. The complex had a small shared courtyard, and my window faced it, so I never worried too much about privacy. The complex was gated, and the courtyard was pretty much deserted after dark. One night, I was having a particularly hard time sleeping because of the heat, so I decided to leave my bedroom window open a bit wider than usual. The blinds were drawn, but the window itself was open, allowing a slight breeze to come through. It was a quiet night, no noises, no movement outside, so I figured it would be fine. I finally dozed off around midnight, lulled to sleep by the occasional chirp of crickets and the faint rustling of leaves. I'm not sure how long I was asleep, but I woke up in the middle of the night with the unsettling feeling that something wasn't right. At first, I thought it was just the usual restlessness from the heat, but then I heard a soft scraping sound coming from near the window. My heart rate immediately spiked. I lay there for a moment, frozen, trying to convince myself it was just the wind or some animal. But then the sound came again, louder this time, more deliberate. It was a slow, dragging noise, like someone or something was outside, scraping against the wall just beneath the window. I slowly sat up in bed, my breath catching in my throat. The room was dark, but the faint glow of the streetlights outside cast long, eerie shadows across the walls. My eyes darted to the window, the blinds still drawn, but I could see the faint outline of the open gap at the bottom. For a moment, I debated whether or not to move. Maybe it was just my imagination, I told myself. I should just lie back down and go to sleep. But as I sat there, straining to listen, I heard it again, the sound of something tapping lightly against the glass. That's when I saw it. A shadow moved outside the window, just barely visible through the small gap in the blinds. It was subtle, but there was no mistaking it. Someone was standing right outside, inches from where I slept. My heart was pounding in my chest as I tried to stay perfectly still, hoping that whoever it was couldn't see me. But as I watched, the shadow grew larger, and then I saw it, something far more terrifying. A face. It was pressed against the window, just visible through the gap in the blinds. I could only see part of it, a sliver of a cheek, an eye, but it was enough to send chills down my spine. The eye was wide, staring into the room, scanning it. I don't know how long he had been standing there, but it was clear that he was watching me. And now, he knew I was awake. I wanted to scream, but fear paralyzed me. My body felt like it was made of lead. All I could do was sit there, watching in horror as the man outside moved slightly, his breath fogging up the glass as he leaned closer. Then, slowly, I saw his hand reach up and press against the window, his fingers tapping lightly on the glass. It was deliberate, like he was testing to see if I'd respond. I couldn't take it anymore. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and bolted out of the bedroom, slamming the door behind me. I locked it, my hands shaking uncontrollably as I dialed 911. I was whispering, trying not to make too much noise, but my voice came out shaky and frantic as I told the operator what was happening. The dispatcher stayed on the line with me, telling me to stay calm and that the police were on their way. I crouched down in the hallway, my back pressed against the wall, my heart racing as I listened for any sign of the man outside. The apartment was eerily quiet now, the only sound the distant hum of the air outside. It felt like hours before I finally heard the sound of sirens in the distance. When the police arrived, they searched the entire complex but found no trace of the man. No footprints, no signs of forced entry, nothing. It was as if he had just vanished. I gave them a description of what I saw: the face, the hand, the eye, but it wasn't much. I hadn't seen him clearly enough to offer anything useful, just vague details that wouldn't help identify him. The officers reassured me that they would keep an eye on the area, but there wasn't much else they could do. For the next few nights, I couldn't sleep. Every creak, every rustle outside my window made my heart race. I kept all the windows shut, locked the doors, and checked them over and over again before going to bed. But the feeling of being watched never went away. A few days later, one of my neighbors mentioned something strange. She said she had seen a man standing near the gate to the complex late at night, just standing there, watching. She didn't think much of it at the time, just assumed he was waiting for someone, but now that I had told her what happened, it made her uneasy too. The man never came back, at least, not that I know of. But to this day, I can't shake the image of that eye staring at me through the blinds, and the sickening feeling that he had been watching me for longer than I realized. So, to the man in the window that night, whoever you are, let's not meet. This happened about 3 years ago, and it still makes my skin crawl just thinking about it. I've never shared it publicly, but after stumbling across this subreddit, I figured it's the perfect place. I genuinely hope none of you ever experience something like this. To set the scene, I was 22 at the time and living in a small college town in the Midwest. It wasn't the most exciting place, but it was peaceful, and for the most part, I felt safe. My boyfriend at the time, Kevin, lived about 30 minutes away in the neighboring city. We would take turns visiting each other on weekends, and this story takes place during one of those visits. Kevin had invited me to a party at one of his friends' houses. The night was going great, we were drinking, laughing, and just having fun with the usual crowd. Around 1 a.m., I realized I had to get going. I had an early shift at my part-time job the next morning and couldn't afford to stay out much later. Kevin offered to let me crash at his place, but I was stubborn and insisted on driving back to my apartment. In hindsight, I should have stayed. I said my goodbyes and hopped in my car, fully expecting an easy drive home. The route was familiar, I'd driven it countless times, usually at night, without issue. But that night, I made a wrong turn, and everything changed. About 10 minutes into my drive, I missed my usual exit on the highway. Instead of turning around, I thought I could just take the next exit and navigate my way back. I wasn't too worried, I had my GPS on my phone, and I wasn't in any rush. So, I took the next exit and began following the GPS directions. The road I turned onto was unfamiliar, and I quickly realized it was one of those long, winding country roads with no streetlights. The further I drove, the darker it got. My GPS was acting up, constantly recalculating and giving me conflicting directions. The deeper I went, the more uneasy I started to feel. Eventually, I came to a fork in the road, and the GPS went silent. I had no idea which way to go. Both paths looked equally desolate, with no signs or lights in sight. I hesitated for a moment, then decided to take the left turn, hoping it would eventually lead me back to the main road. That's when things got weird. About 5 minutes down the road, I noticed a car in my rearview mirror. It came out of nowhere, its headlights bright and glaring. At first, I didn't think much of it. It was a rural area, and it wasn't uncommon for people to be out late, especially on weekends. But as I kept driving, I noticed the car was getting closer. A lot closer. I sped up a little, hoping to put some distance between us. The road was narrow and winding, and with no lights or other cars around, I felt like I was in the middle of nowhere. But no matter how fast I went, the car behind me stayed on my tail, its headlights almost blinding in my mirrors. I started to panic. The road was too narrow to pull over, and there were no turn-offs or gas stations in sight. It was just me, the dark road, and this car getting closer and closer. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white, trying to calm myself down. Maybe they were just trying to pass me, I told myself. Maybe I was overreacting. But then the car sped up and pulled alongside me. There was something about the way they were driving that made my stomach turn. It wasn't just that they were trying to pass me, they were matching my speed, staying right beside me, even though there was barely enough room for 2 cars on that road. I glanced over, and that's when I saw him. The driver was a man, mid-40s maybe, with greasy hair and a blank expression. He was staring straight at me, his eyes wide and unblinking. There was no emotion on his face, just this dead, unsettling stare. I sped up again, trying to shake him, but he matched my speed. He started veering his car closer to mine, forcing me toward the edge of the road. My heart was racing, and I was gripping the wheel so tight my hands hurt. Suddenly, he jerked his car toward mine, swerving dangerously close. I panicked and swerved to avoid him, almost driving off the road. The tires skidded on the gravel, and I barely managed to keep control of the car. I slammed on the gas, desperate to get away from him, but he wasn't backing off. He swerved again, this time trying to push me into a ditch on the side of the road. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely think straight. I knew I had to get out of there, fast. Up ahead, I saw what looked like a turn-off, just a small dirt path leading into the woods, but it was my only option. Without thinking, I yanked the wheel and turned down the path, speeding into the trees. The road was rough, but at least it put some distance between me and the man. I kept driving for what felt like an eternity, my hands shaking, my mind racing. I didn't know where the dirt path would lead, but as long as I was away from him, I didn't care. Eventually, I pulled over in a small clearing and shut off the car, trying to catch my breath. I sat there for a while, my heart still pounding, listening for any sign of the man or his car. But there was nothing, just the sound of the wind rustling through the trees and my own heavy breathing. I pulled out my phone, but of course, there was no signal. I had no idea where I was or how far I had driven. All I knew was that I needed to find my way back to the main road, but I wasn't about to go back the way I came. After what felt like hours of sitting there in the dark, I finally started the car again. My hands were still shaking, but I knew I couldn't stay there all night. I slowly made my way back down the dirt path, eventually finding another road that led me back to the highway. When I finally got home, I locked the doors, pulled all the curtains, and sat on my bed in the dark for hours, just trying to calm down. I couldn't shake the image of that man's face, his blank, soulless eyes staring at me through the car window, and the way he had tried to force me off the road. The next morning, I told Kevin what had happened. He was horrified and insisted I report it to the police. I did, but without a license plate number or a clear description of the man, there wasn't much they could do. They told me they'd keep an eye out for any reports of similar incidents, but I never heard anything after that. To this day, I have no idea who that man was or what he wanted. But every time I drive at night, I can't help but look over my shoulder, expecting to see those headlights again, creeping up behind me. So, to the man who tried to run me off the road that night, let's not meet. Dot. 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 I've been an avid camper all my life. There's something about the isolation, the peacefulness of nature, and the quiet nights under the stars that always drew me in. I grew up camping with my family, and as an adult, I often went on solo trips to escape the chaos of city life. What happened on this particular trip, though, still sends chills down my spine. This happened about 4 years ago, and I haven't camped alone since. It was the middle of summer, and I had planned a weekend getaway at one of my favorite campsites deep in the woods of northern Michigan. It was a remote spot, about a 2-hour hike from where I parked my car, and I loved that it was far enough from any main roads or towns that I could truly be alone. I'd been there a few times before and never had any issues. There was a lake nearby, dense forest all around, and usually, I wouldn't see a single person the entire trip. That's exactly what I was looking for, a weekend of solitude, just me, my tent, and the wilderness. The first night was uneventful. I set up camp, made a small fire, cooked some dinner, and then sat by the fire reading until it got too dark. Afterward, I climbed into my tent, zipped up my sleeping bag, and quickly drifted off to sleep, listening to the sounds of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. I woke up around 2 a.m. to a strange noise outside my tent. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer, rustling through the bushes. I've encountered wildlife on camping trips before, so I didn't think much of it. I lay still, listening, waiting for the sound to pass. But it didn't. Instead of fading away, the rustling grew louder. It was slow and deliberate, like someone or something was walking around my campsite. My heart rate spiked. I told myself it was just a large animal, maybe a bear, but I hadn't heard any footsteps that heavy. This sounded different. Like someone was moving carefully, trying not to make too much noise. I slowly sat up, my hands shaking as I grabbed my flashlight. I didn't want to make any sudden movements, so I stayed quiet, just listening. The rustling continued, circling the perimeter of my tent. It was like whoever or whatever was out there was checking me out. I finally worked up the courage to turn on the flashlight. I unzipped the tent flap just a little, enough to peek out into the darkness. The beam of light cut through the trees, illuminating the underbrush. But I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary, no animals, no people. But the noise stopped. The silence was even worse than the rustling. I felt like I was being watched. My heart was racing, every nerve in my body screaming at me to stay alert. I scanned the area again with the flashlight, but nothing moved. No eyes reflecting back at me, no shadows darting behind trees. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was just a deer or some other animal that had wandered too close and then left. I zipped the tent back up, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I lay back down, wide awake, straining to listen for any other sounds. Eventually, I must have dozed off again because I woke up to the sound of a twig snapping outside my tent. My eyes snapped open, and my pulse immediately skyrocketed. I listened carefully, holding my breath. The footsteps were back, and this time, they were closer. I could hear the crunch of leaves underfoot, slow and deliberate, like someone was pacing just outside. I grabbed the flashlight again, my hand shaking so badly I could barely hold it. I unzipped the tent just enough to shine the light out, but before I could look outside, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A low, raspy voice. "Come out." I froze. My brain couldn't process what I had just heard. The voice was quiet but clear, and it was definitely coming from just outside my tent. "Come out here," the voice repeated, this time louder. I was paralyzed with fear. Every instinct was telling me to stay hidden, to not make a sound. But whoever was out there knew I was inside the tent. They had to have seen my flashlight or heard me moving around earlier. I sat there in the dark, clutching the flashlight, trying to keep my breathing quiet, hoping that whoever it was would just go away. But the footsteps continued, slow and methodical, circling my tent. "Come on out," the voice said again, dragging out the words like they were savoring every syllable. I couldn't stay silent anymore. I had to do something. I quickly turned off the flashlight, hoping that maybe, just maybe, the darkness would make them lose interest and leave. But instead, the footsteps stopped. The voice, now low and menacing, came again. "I know you're in there." My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I had no idea what this person wanted, but I knew that opening the tent or revealing myself was the last thing I should do. After what felt like an eternity of silence, I heard the footsteps again, moving away from the tent. They grew fainter and fainter until, finally, they disappeared altogether. I sat there in the dark for hours, too terrified to move, straining to hear if the person would come back. Every little sound made me jump, my nerves completely shot. I didn't sleep at all for the rest of the night. As soon as the sun started to rise, I packed up my things as quickly as I could. My hands were still shaking, and I kept looking around, expecting to see someone watching me from the trees. But there was no one. The forest was eerily quiet, almost too quiet, as if the world itself was holding its breath. I hiked back to my car without stopping, my heart racing the entire time. I'd never been so relieved to see my car in my life. I threw my gear in the back seat and got the hell out of there, not looking back once. To this day, I have no idea who that person was or what they wanted. I never went back to that campsite, and I've only been camping with friends since then. Something about that night shook me to my core, and the thought of being out there alone again just isn't something I can handle anymore. So, to the creepy camper who tried to lure me out of my tent that night, let's not meet. I've always enjoyed hiking alone. It's peaceful, gives me time to think, and I've never really been the type to get spooked easily. But after what happened to me a couple of years ago, I've been a lot more cautious about where I go and when. This story takes place in the fall of 2018. I had just moved to a new town in the Pacific Northwest, an area known for its beautiful forests and hiking trails. One weekend, I decided to check out a new trail I'd heard about from a coworker. He said it wasn't too well known, but the views were incredible, and it wasn't too far from town. Perfect, I thought. I loved the idea of being out in nature without running into tons of people. It was late afternoon when I started the hike, figuring I'd finish just before sunset. The trailhead was about 40 minutes from town, and the path itself was tucked into a dense part of the forest, winding through towering trees that blocked most of the sunlight. As soon as I set out, I could feel that eerie, peaceful isolation that only comes from being deep in the woods. The first hour was uneventful. I followed the narrow trail as it snaked through the trees, the leaves crunching beneath my boots, and the only sounds were the distant chirps of birds and the occasional rustling of wind. It was beautiful, exactly what I was hoping for, complete solitude. About halfway through the hike, though, things started to feel off. It's hard to explain, but you know that sensation when you feel like you're being watched? It crept up on me slowly, at first just a vague unease that I tried to brush off. But as I kept walking, the feeling grew stronger, more unsettling. I stopped for a moment, telling myself it was just my imagination. The forest was quiet, too quiet, almost as if everything had gone still around me. I scanned the trees, half expecting to see a deer or some other animal, but there was nothing, just the thick wall of trees on either side of the trail. Shaking off the weird feeling, I decided to keep going. I was almost at the halfway point, and I didn't want to turn back for no reason. Besides, I had hiked alone plenty of times before, and I had never been scared like this. But the further I went, the stronger the sensation became. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my skin prickled as though something or someone was watching me from the shadows. That's when I heard it. A faint snap, like a twig breaking underfoot. It was close, too close for comfort, and it sounded like it had come from just off the trail to my right. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as I scanned the trees again. "Hello?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. No answer. I stood there for a minute, listening intently, but the forest was dead silent again. No wind, no animals, nothing. Just that thick, suffocating stillness. I told myself it had to be a deer or a raccoon, something harmless. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. There was no mistaking the sound of a footstep. Someone was out there, hidden in the trees, watching me. I kept moving, quickening my pace now. The trail had started to loop back toward the trailhead, and I figured if I could just get through the last stretch, I'd be fine. But as I walked, the feeling of being watched only grew stronger, almost unbearable. And then I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, about 30 yards into the trees, there was a figure just standing there, half hidden behind a tree. It was tall and thin, wearing a dark jacket and what looked like a hood or a hat, but I couldn't make out any features. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart nearly leaping out of my chest. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching me. For a moment, I considered calling out, asking if they were lost or needed help, but something about the way they were standing, their stillness, made my stomach churn with fear. I took a slow step back, my breath catching in my throat. The figure still didn't move. I decided to keep walking, forcing myself not to run, even though every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get out of there. As I walked, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting the figure to start following me. Sure enough, after about 50 yards, I saw movement in the trees. The figure was still there, shadowing me from a distance, moving silently between the trees. My pulse quickened, and I felt the panic rise in my chest. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to approach me directly, but they weren't letting me out of their sight either. I could feel their eyes on me, watching my every move. I picked up my pace, trying to act calm, though my heart was racing. The trail was winding back toward the parking lot, but I still had at least 20 minutes to go, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep my cool. Every few minutes, I would glance behind me, and each time, I would catch a glimpse of the figure, sometimes closer, sometimes further, but always there, following me silently through the trees. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I broke into a jog, trying to put some distance between us. The forest flew by in a blur, my boots pounding against the dirt trail. I didn't care about being quiet or cautious anymore, I just wanted to get back to my car. The trail finally opened up into the clearing near the parking lot, and I could see my car in the distance. Relief flooded over me, but I didn't stop. I kept running, not daring to look back until I reached my car. When I finally reached the car and slammed the door shut, I looked back at the trail. The figure was gone. For a few minutes, I just sat there, trying to catch my breath, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I scanned the tree line, but there was no sign of the person who had been following me. It was as if they had melted back into the forest, vanishing without a trace. I never went back to that trail, and I've only hiked in groups since then. I don't know who or what that figure was, but the way they moved, the way they watched me without ever approaching, it still haunts me. So, to the figure in the woods, the one who followed me in silence, let's not meet again. Dot. 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 I used to work at a small gas station in a pretty rural area. The kind of place where most of our customers were regulars, and you got to know the local characters. It wasn't the most exciting job, but it paid the bills, and I didn't mind the late shifts. That is, until one particular night that still gives me nightmares. At the time, I was in my early 20s and often worked the night shift by myself. The station was located on a quiet road, and after 10 p.m., there usually weren't many customers, just the occasional truck driver or someone passing through town. The night shifts were long and boring, and I mostly just cleaned up the store, stocked the shelves, and waited for my shift to end. This night started out like any other. It was a little after midnight, and I was sitting behind the counter, flipping through a magazine, trying to stay awake. The station was empty, and the only sound was the hum of the cooler in the back. Outside, the wind was picking up, rattling the windows, and it was starting to rain, a typical, dreary night. Around 12:30 a.m., the bell above the door jingled, and I looked up to see a man walk in. He was tall and scruffy, wearing a dirty jacket and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. Something about him put me on edge immediately. He didn't look like a typical customer, he was too twitchy, his movements too erratic, like he was uncomfortable in his own skin. "Evening," I called out, trying to keep my tone light and friendly. He didn't respond. Instead, he walked straight to the back of the store, where the coolers with the drinks were. I watched him out of the corner of my eye as he lingered there, staring at the shelves but not really picking anything up. Something about his behavior felt off, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me from the reflection in the glass cooler doors. Every so often, he'd glance over, his eyes darting toward me before quickly looking away. I felt a chill run down my spine. After a few minutes of this weird behavior, he finally grabbed a soda and made his way to the counter. He placed the drink down, but instead of stepping back like most customers do, he stayed way too close, leaning over the counter slightly, his eyes locked on mine. "How's it going?" I asked, trying to break the tension, even though my voice was shaking a little. Again, no response. I rang up the drink, and when I told him the total, he didn't move to pay. He just stood there, staring at me, his eyes wide and unblinking. I was starting to get seriously creeped out at this point. The store was completely empty, and it was just me and this guy. The station didn't have any security guards or cameras, and the nearest police station was miles away. My phone was in the back office, out of reach, and I was mentally kicking myself for leaving it back there. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he pulled out some crumpled bills and handed them to me. I gave him his change and waited for him to leave, but he didn't. He just stood there, leaning even closer over the counter, his face inches from mine. "You work here alone?" he asked, his voice low and raspy. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't want to let on that I was alone, so I lied. "No, my coworker's in the back," I said, forcing a smile. "He'll be out in a minute." The man didn't react. He just kept staring at me, his lips curling into a slow, unsettling smile. His eyes were dark, almost empty, and there was something deeply wrong about the way he was looking at me, like he was trying to size me up, or maybe trying to figure out if I was lying. "That's too bad," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was hoping we'd be alone." My stomach dropped. He lingered for a moment longer, then finally picked up his soda and walked toward the door. I breathed a sigh of relief, thinking he was leaving, but instead, he stopped at the door and looked back at me. "I'll be seeing you," he said, his voice dripping with menace. The bell jingled as he stepped outside, and I quickly locked the door behind him, my heart pounding in my chest. I watched as he stood outside for a minute, just staring at me through the glass, that same twisted smile on his face. Then, slowly, he turned and walked off into the rain. I was shaking, trying to figure out what to do. I didn't have a car, so I couldn't just leave. There were no other customers, and I was alone until my shift ended at 6 a.m. I debated calling the police, but what would I say? A creepy guy bought a soda and smiled at me? They wouldn't take it seriously, and I knew it. For the next hour, I couldn't focus on anything. Every little sound made me jump, and I kept glancing at the door, half expecting him to come back. I locked myself in the back office for a while, trying to calm down, but the uneasy feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. Around 2 a.m., I heard it. The sound of footsteps outside. I crept out of the office and peered through the front window. There he was, standing under the streetlight in the parking lot, just watching the store. His face was obscured by the rain and shadows, but I knew it was him. He wasn't moving, wasn't trying to come back inside, he was just standing there, staring. My heart was racing again, and I felt sick to my stomach. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't leave, but I sure as hell didn't feel safe inside the store with him lurking outside. After a few minutes, he started to walk slowly around the perimeter of the building, disappearing into the shadows behind the store. I panicked, rushing to lock the back door and check the windows. My mind was racing with all the horrible possibilities of what could happen if he tried to get in. I grabbed a heavy wrench from the maintenance closet and kept it close by, just in case. I waited, my ears straining to hear any sign of movement. The rain was coming down harder now, and the wind howled through the cracks in the windows. Every creak, every sound, made me jump. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a loud bang from the back door. My blood ran cold. I froze, clutching the wrench, my heart hammering in my chest. Another bang, this time louder, like someone was trying to break in. I was shaking so badly I could barely hold the wrench, but I forced myself to move. I crept toward the back of the store, my footsteps quiet, and peeked around the corner. There was nothing. The door was still shut, no signs of forced entry, no one outside. But the banging had stopped, and the silence was even worse than the noise. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I stayed in the back office, the wrench by my side, jumping at every little sound until my shift ended and the morning shift worker came to relieve me. I never told him what had happened, I didn't even know how to explain it. For the next few weeks, I worked the day shifts, avoiding the nights as much as possible. But eventually, I had to cover a night shift again, and the fear came rushing back. Thankfully, I never saw that man again. But to this day, I still get nervous whenever I'm in a gas station at night, half expecting him to walk through the door with that same creepy smile. So, to the man who tried to terrorize me on my late night shift, let's not meet. This happened about 2 years ago, and I still get chills thinking about it. It was one of the strangest and most terrifying experiences of my life, and honestly, it's made me more cautious about where I go and when. I've always been a bit of an adventurer, and I enjoy hiking, especially at night when everything's quiet and peaceful. That's why this experience still haunts me, because I never expected something like this to happen in a place where I've always found comfort. It was a Saturday night in late October, and I was in the mood for a late-night hike. I live in a small town nestled between some mountains, and there's a popular trail about 10 minutes from my house that I've hiked dozens of times. The trail isn't particularly difficult, and I've always felt safe hiking there, even after dark. I was familiar with every twist and turn, every rock and tree. It was my go-to place when I needed to clear my head. That night, I grabbed my headlamp, threw on a jacket, and headed out around 10 p.m. The sky was clear, and the moonlight filtered through the trees, casting eerie shadows along the path. There was a slight chill in the air, but nothing out of the ordinary for that time of year. I started up the trail, feeling completely at ease. The first part of the hike was uneventful. I made my way up the trail, enjoying the solitude. The woods were silent, except for the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. I wasn't scared or nervous. I'd hiked this trail countless times and knew it like the back of my hand. After about 45 minutes, I reached a small clearing where the trees opened up, revealing a view of the valley below. This was my favorite spot to sit and take in the view, and that night was no different. I found a large rock, sat down, and pulled out my water bottle, planning to take a short break before heading back down the trail. That's when I noticed something strange. I had been sitting there for maybe 5 minutes when I heard footsteps, very faint, but distinct. They were coming from somewhere behind me, further up the trail. My first thought was that it was just another hiker. Even though it was late, this trail was relatively well known, and I wasn't the only night hiker in the area. But something about the footsteps felt off. They were slow, deliberate, almost too quiet, like whoever was walking was trying to avoid making noise. I strained to listen, my heart rate picking up slightly. The footsteps stopped. I turned around, scanning the tree line with my headlamp, but there was nothing there. Just trees, shadows, and the faint glow of the moon above. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was probably just a deer or some other animal. The forest was full of wildlife, and I'd encountered deer on the trail before. I finished my water, stood up, and started making my way back down the trail. But as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The air felt heavier, the woods unnervingly quiet. No birds, no wind, just an eerie stillness that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. After about 5 minutes, I heard the footsteps again. This time, they were closer. I stopped in my tracks, listening carefully. The footsteps stopped too, as if whoever or whatever was following me knew I had stopped. My heart was pounding in my chest now. I turned my headlamp off, standing still in the darkness, trying to listen. Nothing. I waited for what felt like an eternity, my ears straining for any sound. But there was only silence. After a few minutes, I turned the light back on and started walking again, this time a little faster. That's when I heard it again, the footsteps, even closer now. I whipped around, shining my light into the trees, but there was nothing there. Just the empty trail behind me and the dense wall of trees on either side. But I knew I wasn't imagining it. Someone or something was following me. My stomach dropped, and a cold wave of fear washed over me. I had hiked this trail at night dozens of times, and I had never felt this kind of dread before. I quickened my pace, practically speedwalking down the trail now, but the footsteps continued, always staying just out of sight, always matching my speed. I was in full panic mode at this point, my heart racing, adrenaline pumping through my veins. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something lunging out of the shadows. But the trail behind me remained empty, save for the faint sound of those damn footsteps. I don't know what possessed me to do it, but after about 10 minutes of this terrifying game of cat and mouse, I stopped suddenly and yelled out, "Who's there?" My voice echoed through the trees, but there was no response. The footsteps stopped again, and the silence was deafening. For a few seconds, I stood there, waiting for something to happen. My whole body was on edge, every nerve screaming at me to run. But I stayed frozen, listening. Then, from somewhere deeper in the woods, I heard it. A low, raspy voice. "Come closer." I froze. The voice was barely audible, but it was unmistakable. Someone was out there, calling to me from the darkness. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, and I did. I bolted down the trail as fast as I could, not caring about the noise or the branches slapping against my face. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear anything over the blood rushing in my ears. But the footsteps, they were back, and they were faster this time, like whoever was out there had decided to chase me. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just ran, my headlamp bouncing wildly, casting frantic shadows across the trees. The trail felt endless, like I'd never reached the end, like I was trapped in some kind of nightmare loop. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only a few minutes, I saw the trailhead up ahead, the faint glow of the parking lot lights shining through the trees. I sprinted toward it, my legs burning, my lungs aching. I burst into the parking lot, breathless and shaking, and ran straight to my car. I fumbled with my keys, my hands trembling so badly I could barely unlock the door. When I finally got inside, I slammed the door shut and locked it, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. I sat there for a few minutes, staring at the dark trailhead, half expecting to see someone emerge from the trees. But no one came. The parking lot was empty. The trail was silent. Eventually, I started the car and drove home, my hands still shaking on the steering wheel. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half convinced that whoever had been following me would be standing on the side of the road, watching me as I left. I never found out who or what was in the woods that night. But I do know one thing, I've never gone hiking at night again, and I don't plan to anytime soon. So, to the person or thing that followed me in the woods that night, let's not meet. Dot. 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 I never thought something as simple as a wrong food delivery could lead to one of the most terrifying nights of my life. This happened about a year ago, and I still get anxious when I hear someone knocking on my door late at night. At the time, I was living in a small apartment complex in a suburban area. It wasn't the nicest place, but it was affordable, and I'd never had any problems with the neighborhood. I worked late shifts, so I was used to coming home after dark, making myself a late dinner, and winding down before bed. It was a routine I followed almost every night. One Friday night, after a particularly exhausting shift, I got home around 10:30 p.m. I was too tired to cook, so I decided to order some takeout from a local restaurant. I used one of those food delivery apps and placed an order for some Chinese food. The restaurant wasn't far, so I expected the delivery within 30 minutes or so. I was sitting on my couch, watching TV, and waiting for my food when I got a notification from the app saying my delivery had arrived. That was odd, I hadn't heard anyone knock or ring the doorbell. I checked the app again, and it said the driver had left the food outside my door. Confused, I got up and went to check. When I opened the door, there was nothing there. No bag of food, no sign of a delivery. I figured maybe the driver had left it at the wrong apartment. It wouldn't be the first time. My building had identical units, and I'd had a couple of mix-ups with packages before. I stepped outside and walked down the hall, checking the other doors. The hall was dimly lit, and I could hear the distant hum of someone's TV through one of the walls. Everything seemed normal, no food at any of the other doors, no one in the hall. I was about to go back inside and call the delivery service when I heard a knock. It wasn't a normal knock, it was soft, almost hesitant, like whoever was knocking didn't want to be heard. The sound came from further down the hall, near the stairwell that led to the ground floor. I turned, my heart skipping a beat. There was a man standing there, just barely visible in the shadows near the stairwell. He was tall, wearing a dark hoodie with the hood pulled up over his head, and his face was mostly hidden. He wasn't carrying a food delivery bag, and I immediately knew something was off. "Did you order something?" he asked, his voice low and raspy. The way he asked the question, the way he was just standing there in the shadows, made my skin crawl. My instincts were screaming at me that this wasn't a delivery driver. "No, I didn't," I said, backing up toward my apartment door. The man didn't move. He just stood there, watching me. "You sure about that?" he asked, taking a slow step forward. At this point, my heart was racing. I didn't know what this guy wanted, but it definitely wasn't to deliver food. I turned and quickly walked back into my apartment, locking the door behind me. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my phone, thinking I should call the delivery service to report the mix-up. Maybe it really was just some weird mistake. But before I could dial, I heard another knock. This time, it was at my door. My stomach dropped. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The knock was soft, just like before, but I knew it was him. For a moment, I didn't know what to do. I stood there, staring at the door, listening. He knocked again, 3 slow, deliberate taps. "Hey," he called softly. "Your food's out here." I didn't respond. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what was happening. Why was he knocking on my door? Why had he followed me back to my apartment? I stepped away from the door, my hands trembling as I dialed the delivery service. When I finally got through to someone, I quickly explained what was happening. The woman on the other end sounded concerned and checked the records for my order. "Ma'am," she said, "the delivery driver already completed your order 10 minutes ago. He marked it as delivered." I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me. "That wasn't the driver," I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. "There's a man outside my door. He's pretending to be the delivery driver." The woman told me to hang up and call the police, which I did immediately. I was shaking so badly I could barely dial the number. The dispatcher on the other end was calm and asked me to stay on the line while they sent an officer to my building. While I waited, I heard the man outside knock again, louder this time. "Come on," he said, his voice now more demanding. "Just open the door. I've got your food." I stayed silent, praying he would go away. I had turned off all the lights in my apartment and was crouched behind my couch, trying not to make a sound. After what felt like an eternity, I heard footsteps walking away from my door, followed by the sound of the stairwell door creaking open. I didn't move until I heard the soft thud of the stairwell door closing. A few minutes later, there was a knock at my door again, but this time, it was the police. I let them in, still shaking, and explained everything that had happened. They did a sweep of the building and checked the stairwell, but the man was gone. They asked if I had gotten a good look at his face, but I hadn't. All I could remember was the dark hoodie and his creepy voice. The officers stayed with me for a while, reassuring me that they would patrol the area for the rest of the night. They also suggested I contact my building management and ask about getting security cameras installed, which I did the next day. The weirdest part? When I followed up with the delivery service the next morning, they told me the real driver had delivered my food to the correct address, another unit in my building. I guess my neighbor had accidentally gotten my order, but they never bothered to tell me or bring it over. So who was the man outside my door? To this day, I have no idea who he was or what his intentions were. But I can't shake the feeling that it wasn't just a coincidence. The way he lingered, the way he tried to get me to open the door, it felt too deliberate, too predatory. I moved out of that apartment a few months later, and I haven't had any similar experiences since. But I'm much more cautious now. I never answer the door unless I'm 100% sure who's on the other side. So, to the man pretending to be my delivery driver that night, let's not meet. This happened about 5 years ago when I was still in college. I've never been one to scare easily, but after this experience, I've become way more cautious about where I go at night and who I interact with. I've never shared this story before, but I think it might help me process it, even though it's been years. It was late on a Friday night, probably around 11:30 p.m., and I had just finished a long shift at my part-time job. I worked at a local diner, which stayed open late to cater to the college crowd, and that night had been unusually busy. By the time I clocked out, I was exhausted and just wanted to get home. The drive to my apartment was about 20 minutes, and I had just enough gas to make it, but I figured I'd stop at a gas station on the way so I wouldn't have to worry about it in the morning. I pulled into the first gas station I came across. It was a small, sketchy-looking place on the outskirts of town, the kind of gas station that had flickering lights and a single pump. I'd driven by it before but had never stopped. There was no one else around, and the place looked deserted, but I figured it'd only take a few minutes to fill up and be on my way. As I got out of the car and started pumping gas, I noticed a man walking toward the station from the direction of the road. He was wearing a dark hoodie, his hands stuffed into his pockets, and he seemed to be moving slowly, almost like he was lost or unsure of where he was going. I immediately felt a little uneasy. Something about the way he moved put me on edge, but I brushed it off as paranoia. Maybe he was just another college student heading back from a late-night party or a bar. I kept my head down, focusing on the gas pump, but I couldn't help glancing over at him every few seconds. He was getting closer, and I realized he wasn't walking toward the station itself, he was walking directly toward me. My heart rate spiked, and I tried to stay calm. I told myself it was just a coincidence, that maybe he was going to ask for directions or for help. Still, every instinct in my body was screaming at me that something was wrong. When he got about 20 feet away, he slowed down and stopped, just standing there in the dim light of the station. His face was obscured by the hood, but I could feel his eyes on me, watching. "Hey," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "You got a minute?" I froze, my hand tightening on the gas pump. The way he asked the question sent chills down my spine. It wasn't friendly or casual, there was something off about it, something that made my stomach twist with fear. No, I'm kind of in a hurry," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. I hoped that would be enough to get him to leave, but he didn't move. He just stood there, staring at me. I could feel my pulse quickening, and I glanced around the station, realizing there was no one else around. The lights inside the station's small convenience store were off, and the place looked abandoned. I quickly finished pumping my gas and screwed the cap back on, all while keeping one eye on the man. He took a step closer, and my panic started to rise. "You sure you don't have a minute?" he asked, his voice even lower this time. "I just need to talk to you." He was closer now, and I could see his face more clearly under the streetlight. His expression was blank, but his eyes were cold, almost predatory. Every instinct in my body was telling me to get out of there. "I really don't," I said, trying to sound firm but feeling my voice shake slightly. "I'm sorry." I quickly turned and opened my car door, my hands trembling as I tried to get in. But before I could close the door, he took another step forward, moving faster this time. "Wait," he said, his voice suddenly more urgent. "Just wait a minute. I need to talk to you." Panic surged through me, and without thinking, I slammed the car door shut and locked it. My heart was racing, and my hands were shaking as I fumbled to start the engine. The man stepped right up to my window, his face inches from the glass. I couldn't hear what he was saying anymore, his voice was muffled, but I could see his lips moving as he pressed his hands against the window, staring at me with those cold, dark eyes. He wasn't banging on the window or shouting, he was just calmly talking, but something about the way he moved, the way he looked at me, was deeply disturbing. I threw the car into reverse, my hands trembling so badly I could barely grip the wheel, and floored it. The tires screeched as I backed up, my heart pounding in my chest. The man didn't chase me, he just stood there, watching as I sped out of the gas station and back onto the road. I didn't stop driving until I was halfway home, my hands still shaking on the wheel. I pulled over to the side of the road, trying to calm down, my mind racing. What did he want? Why had he been so insistent? And why didn't he leave when I told him I wasn't interested? I never found out who that man was or what his intentions were, but something about the way he looked at me, the way he followed me, still haunts me. I've never stopped at that gas station again, and now, I always make sure to fill up my tank before dark. So, to the creepy man at the gas station who tried to talk to me that night, let's not meet. Dot. 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 This happened about 6 years ago, and I still get chills thinking about it. I've always been a night owl, so I used to take walks late at night to clear my head. There's something peaceful about the world when it's quiet, the streets are empty, and everything is still. After what happened that night, though, I stopped taking those walks, and to this day, I get nervous when I'm out alone after dark. At the time, I was living in a small apartment in a relatively quiet neighborhood. It wasn't the nicest area, but it was safe enough. My late-night walks were usually around 11 p.m. or midnight, and I'd walk the same route, just a few blocks down to a local park, then loop around and head back home. I never had any issues and rarely saw anyone else on my route, which made me feel like I had the whole world to myself. One night, it was a little after 11 p.m., and I decided to take one of my usual walks. The air was crisp, and the streets were empty, just as they always were. I slipped on my headphones, put on some music, and set out. The first part of the walk was uneventful. I passed a few houses, some with lights still on, but the streets were mostly dark and quiet. The only sound was the soft crunch of my footsteps on the pavement and the faint hum of music in my ears. When I reached the park, I did my usual loop around the playground and started heading back toward my apartment. As I walked, I noticed something strange, a figure standing on the sidewalk, maybe a block ahead of me. They were standing still, facing in my direction, but they weren't moving. At first, I didn't think much of it. It wasn't that unusual to see someone out for a late-night stroll, and I figured it was just another night owl like me. I kept walking, but as I got closer, I realized something was off. The person wasn't walking. They were just standing there, completely still, watching me. I felt a flicker of unease but told myself it was nothing. Maybe they were waiting for someone or taking a break during their walk. Still, I slowed my pace a bit, keeping my eyes on the figure. They were standing under a streetlight, their face partially obscured by the shadows. I could make out that they were tall and wearing a long coat, but I couldn't see any other details. As I approached, they still didn't move. Just stood there, watching me. By this point, my unease was growing. I decided to cross the street to avoid walking directly past them. I glanced both ways, then quickly crossed over, keeping my pace steady. But the moment I stepped onto the other side of the street, the figure moved. They started walking too slowly, deliberately matching my pace, but still on the opposite side of the street. I felt a chill run down my spine. I kept walking, my heart starting to race. I didn't want to look over, but I could feel the figure keeping pace with me, always a few steps behind. The street was eerily quiet, and I could hear the faint sound of their footsteps echoing off the pavement, even over my music. At the next intersection, I decided to test something. Instead of continuing straight, I made a sharp right turn, heading down a side street that led away from my usual route. I glanced over my shoulder, and sure enough, the figure followed. They were still on the opposite side of the street, but they had definitely turned with me. My pulse quickened, and I could feel my anxiety spiking. Something was wrong. This person wasn't just out for a walk, they were following me. I quickened my pace, almost breaking into a jog, but the figure did the same, keeping pace with me, always on the opposite side of the street. At this point, I was panicking. My apartment was still a few blocks away, and I didn't want to lead this person back to where I lived. I needed to lose them or at least find somewhere safe. But there was no one around, no cars, no open businesses, no people. Just me and this figure, walking in tandem through the empty streets. I decided to try something drastic. I picked up my pace again, this time breaking into a full sprint, and darted down an alleyway between two buildings. My heart was pounding in my chest as I ran, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I reached the end of the alley and stopped, pressing myself against the wall, trying to listen. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, I heard it, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the mouth of the alley. The figure had followed me. I could see their shadows stretching out on the pavement as they walked toward the alley, their pace slow and steady, as if they knew exactly where I was. I couldn't wait any longer. I bolted out the other end of the alley, running as fast as I could down the street. My only thought was to get to somewhere with people, somewhere I could be safe. I didn't look back, I couldn't. I just ran. After what felt like forever, I finally reached a convenience store at the corner of the next block. The lights were on, and there were a few people inside. I stumbled through the door, out of breath and shaking. The clerk looked at me, concerned. "Are you okay?" I didn't answer right away. I just stood there, trying to catch my breath, my heart racing. Finally, I managed to explain that someone had been following me. The clerk immediately offered to call the police, but when I looked out the window, the figure was gone. There was no one on the street. No sign of the person who had been following me. It was like they had vanished into thin air. The police showed up about 20 minutes later, but there wasn't much they could do. I didn't have a clear description of the person, they had stayed in the shadows the entire time. All I could tell them was that it was a tall figure in a long coat, but that wasn't much to go on. I stayed at the convenience store for a while, waiting until I felt safe enough to walk home. When I finally did, I made sure to take a different route, constantly glancing over my shoulder, terrified that the figure might still be out there, watching me. I never saw them again, but I stopped taking night walks after that. The peace and quiet I used to love had been replaced by a constant feeling of dread, a fear that someone could be lurking in the shadows, following my every move. So, to the figure who followed me through the empty streets that night, let's not meet. This happened when I was about 19 years old, and to this day, it's the scariest experience of my life. I grew up in a small town surrounded by forests, and I always loved exploring the woods. My friends and I would often hike through the trails, camp out, and just enjoy being surrounded by nature. It was peaceful and quiet, and I always felt safe out there. One weekend, my friends and I decided to go camping at one of our usual spots, a clearing deep in the woods about an hour's hike from the nearest road. We'd been to this spot many times before, and it had always been a fun escape from the stresses of life. There were 5 of us, me, my best friend Dave, and 3 other guys we'd known since high school. We packed up our gear, hiked out to the clearing, and set up camp. The first night was perfect, clear skies, a warm fire, and plenty of laughs. We stayed up late, telling ghost stories and roasting marshmallows, and eventually, we all crawled into our tents and fell asleep. The second day was just as great. We spent the day hiking, swimming in a nearby stream, and just hanging out in the woods. By the time the sun started to set, we were all pretty exhausted. We made another fire, cooked some dinner, and settled in for another night of camping. That's when things started to get strange. It was probably around 10 p.m., and we were all sitting around the fire when we heard something, a faint rustling sound coming from the trees. At first, we thought it was just an animal. There were plenty of deer and raccoons in the area, and it wasn't uncommon to hear them moving around at night. But as we listened, the rustling grew louder, and it didn't sound like an animal anymore. It sounded like footsteps. Dave stood up, shining his flashlight toward the edge of the clearing. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice low and tense. We all nodded, standing up and grabbing our flashlights. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, and they seemed to be getting closer. My heart was pounding in my chest as we scanned the tree line, but there was nothing, just darkness and the faint glow of our fire. "Maybe it's another hiker," one of the guys suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. We called out into the woods, asking if anyone was there, but there was no response. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, everything was quiet again. We sat back down, trying to shake off the eerie feeling that had settled over the camp, but I couldn't stop glancing toward the trees. Something didn't feel right. I've spent enough time in the woods to know when something's off, and this definitely felt off. About 20 minutes later, just as we were starting to relax again, we heard the footsteps return. This time, they were even closer, coming from the opposite side of the clearing. We all jumped up, shining our flashlights in the direction of the sound. And that's when we saw him. Standing just at the edge of the clearing was a man. He was tall, wearing a dirty jacket and jeans, and his face was mostly obscured by the shadows. He didn't say anything, didn't move, just stood there, staring at us. "Hey, man, you okay?" Dave called out, his voice shaky. The man didn't respond. He just kept staring, his face hidden in the darkness. I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me. There was something about the way he was standing, the way he was watching us, that made my skin crawl. He wasn't acting like someone who was lost or needed help, he was just observing us. "We're just camping out here," Dave said, trying to sound calm. "Do you need something?" Still nothing. We all stood there in silence, staring at the man, waiting for him to say or do something. But he didn't. He just kept standing there, unmoving. Finally, one of the guys stepped forward. "Look, if you need help, we can." Before he could finish his sentence, the man turned and walked back into the woods, disappearing into the darkness without a word. We all stood there for a few minutes, frozen, listening for any sign of him, but there was nothing. The woods were silent again, save for the crackling of the fire and the distant chirping of crickets. "That was weird," Dave muttered, lowering his flashlight. We tried to laugh it off, convincing ourselves that it was just some strange guy passing through, maybe a local who lived nearby. But deep down, none of us believed that. The whole thing felt wrong, like he had been watching us for a while before we noticed him. The rest of the night, we were all on edge. Every little sound made us jump, and we kept our flashlights close, scanning the trees for any sign of the man. But he didn't come back. By the time we finally crawled into our tents, I was too anxious to sleep. I lay there for hours, listening to the sounds of the forest, waiting for the footsteps to return. The next morning, we packed up camp and headed back to the car earlier than we had planned. None of us wanted to stick around after what had happened the night before. The hike back was uneventful, and by the time we reached the car, we were all starting to relax again, figuring it had just been a weird encounter and nothing more. But as we were loading up the car, one of the guys stopped suddenly, his face pale. "Guys," he said, his voice shaky. "Look at this." We all turned to where he was pointing, and my blood ran cold. There, scratched into the dirt next to our car, were deep, deliberate marks, like someone had dragged a stick or something sharp along the ground. The scratches formed a pattern, a rough, uneven circle with an X through the middle. We stood there in stunned silence, trying to make sense of it. None of us had done that, and it definitely hadn't been there when we arrived the day before. "Do you think it was that guy?" one of the guys asked, his voice barely above a whisper. None of us had an answer. We hurriedly loaded up the car and got out of there as fast as we could. The whole drive back, we didn't say much, all of us too freaked out by what had happened. To this day, we have no idea who that man was or what he wanted, but the way he stood there, watching us, and the strange markings by our car, still haunt me. I haven't been camping since, and I don't think I ever will again. So, to the man in the forest, the one who watched us from the shadows, let's not meet. Dot. 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 About 4 years ago, I had to take a long road trip for a work-related event. I was driving from my small town in the Midwest to a city about 12 hours away. I'd done plenty of long drives before, but this one felt different. It was a little last minute, and I had to leave in the evening because of work. This meant most of my drive would be through the night. I've never been too nervous about driving alone, even at night. I enjoy the solitude and the quiet, and I usually have a good playlist to keep me company. But this trip would change the way I look at nighttime driving forever. I left my house around 6 p.m., expecting to drive straight through the night and get to my destination by early morning. The first few hours of the trip were fine, but as the sun set and the highway stretched out in front of me, I realized I was getting more tired than I expected. It was around 11 p.m. when I started to struggle to keep my eyes open, and by midnight, I knew I needed to pull over and get some sleep. The problem was, I was in the middle of nowhere. There were no major towns for miles, just endless dark stretches of highway and the occasional small cluster of houses. I kept driving, hoping I'd find a rest stop or a motel soon. Finally, after what felt like forever, I saw a sign for a motel about 5 miles off the highway. It wasn't part of a chain or anything, just one of those small, independently owned motels you find on lonely backroads. I figured it would be good enough for a few hours of sleep, so I took the exit and followed the road to the motel. When I pulled into the parking lot, I immediately felt uneasy. The motel looked rundown, with flickering neon lights and a cracked sign that barely read vacancy. There were a few cars in the parking lot, but the place seemed mostly deserted. It wasn't the kind of place I would normally stay, but I was too tired to care. I just wanted a bed for the night. I went inside to check in. The lobby was small, dimly lit, and smelled like mildew. Behind the front desk was an old man, probably in his late 60s, who greeted me with a strange smile that made me uncomfortable. He was friendly enough, but something about him seemed off. His eyes didn't quite match his smile, like he was sizing me up. I asked for a room, and he handed me a key, pointing down the hall. "Room 9, he said, still smiling. "Have a good night." I mumbled a thank you and walked quickly down the hall to my room. The whole place had a creepy vibe, but I tried to brush it off. It was late, I was tired, and my imagination was probably just getting the best of me. I unlocked the door to room 9 and stepped inside. The room was as rundown as the outside of the motel. The carpet was stained, the furniture looked like it hadn't been updated in decades, and the bedspread was faded and frayed at the edges. But I was too tired to care. I locked the door, put my suitcase on the bed, and sat down to take off my shoes. That's when I heard it. A soft knock on the door. I froze. It was almost 1 a.m. by this point, and I hadn't seen anyone else when I checked in. Who would be knocking on my door this late at night? I sat there for a moment, debating whether or not to answer, when the knock came again, this time louder, more insistent. "Who is it?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. There was a pause, and then a voice responded. "It's the front desk. I need to talk to you for a moment." I hesitated, something about the voice sending a chill down my spine. It didn't sound like the old man from the front desk, it was deeper, more unsettling. I stayed where I was, not wanting to open the door. "I'm really tired," I said, trying to sound casual. "Can we talk in the morning?" Another pause, and then the voice came again, this time sounding more annoyed. "It'll just take a minute. Open the door." My heart started to race. Something wasn't right. There was no reason for the front desk to be bothering me this late, and the more I listened, the more the voice felt wrong, like whoever was out there was trying to trick me. I stood up quietly and moved to the door, peeking through the peephole. There was no one there. The hallway was empty. I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest. I had definitely heard someone talking, but now there was no one outside. I stood there for a few moments, listening, trying to figure out what to do. Then the knock came again, louder this time, more aggressive. I backed away from the door, my hands shaking. I didn't know what to do. My car was parked right outside, but I'd have to go down the hall to get to it. And whoever was knocking might still be out there, just out of sight. Suddenly, I heard a low whisper coming from the other side of the door. "Open the door. I know you're in there." My stomach dropped. I quickly grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my hands trembling. The operator answered, and I whispered that someone was outside my door, trying to get in. She told me to stay on the line, stay quiet, and lock myself in the bathroom if possible. I grabbed my keys, threw my stuff back into my bag, and crept toward the bathroom, locking the door behind me. The knocking continued, and now I could hear footsteps pacing outside my door, back and forth, as if someone was waiting for me to open up. The operator stayed on the line with me as I listened to the footsteps, my heart pounding in my ears. After what felt like an eternity, I heard the sound of a car pulling up outside. I peeked through the small bathroom window and saw police lights flashing in the parking lot. I heard the police knock on my door, announcing themselves. After making sure it was safe, I unlocked the door and ran out to meet them. I was shaking and almost in tears, overwhelmed with fear and relief at the same time. The police searched the motel, but they didn't find anyone. Whoever had been knocking on my door had disappeared before they arrived. They questioned the old man at the front desk, but he claimed he hadn't seen or heard anything suspicious. The whole thing left me feeling even more unsettled, like something darker had been going on in that motel. The police escorted me back to my car and suggested I find another place to stay for the night, preferably somewhere closer to the city. I didn't argue. I drove for another hour, not caring how tired I was. I just wanted to get as far away from that motel as possible. I never found out who was knocking on my door that night, or what they wanted. But the memory of that deep, unsettling voice still haunts me. I haven't stayed in a motel since, and I'm a lot more careful about where I stop when I'm on the road. So, to the person who tried to lure me out of my room that night, let's not meet. This happened to me a couple of years ago, and it still gives me the creeps every time I think about it. I've never really been a paranoid person, but after this incident, I'm a lot more cautious when I'm out alone, especially at night. I've never told many people this story, but maybe sharing it here will help someone avoid a similar situation. At the time, I was living in a mid-sized city and working the evening shift at a retail store. My shifts would usually end around 10 p.m., and since I lived about 20 minutes from work, I'd be driving home through mostly quiet streets by the time I got off. One night, after a particularly long and exhausting shift, I was driving home as usual. I hadn't had dinner, so I decided to stop at a grocery store near my apartment to grab something quick before heading home. It was around 10:30 p.m. when I pulled into the parking lot of the grocery store. The store itself was still open, but the parking lot was nearly empty, just a few cars scattered here and there under the dim streetlights. I parked my car near the entrance and headed inside, figuring I'd only be in there for a few minutes. As I walked through the parking lot, I noticed a white van parked a few spaces away from mine. There was nothing too unusual about it at first glance, just an old, beat-up van. But something about the way it was parked caught my attention. It was backed into the space, and the driver's side door was open slightly, like someone had just gotten out or was about to get in. I couldn't see anyone inside, but the whole setup made me feel uneasy for reasons I couldn't quite explain. I brushed it off, convincing myself I was being paranoid, and went inside the store. I grabbed a few things, some microwave meals and snacks, and headed to the self-checkout. I was probably in the store for 10 or 15 minutes, and by the time I finished, I had mostly forgotten about the van. But when I stepped back outside, the uneasy feeling returned. The parking lot was even emptier now, and the white van was still there, parked in the same spot, with the driver's door still slightly ajar. As I walked toward my car, I noticed a figure standing next to the van. It was a man, tall and thin, leaning against the van as if he was waiting for something or someone. His back was turned to me, and I couldn't see his face, but the moment I saw him, my stomach dropped. I slowed down, debating whether I should keep walking toward my car or go back inside the store. The man hadn't noticed me yet, but the whole situation felt wrong. Why was he just standing there? Why hadn't he gone inside the store or driven away? I decided to keep walking, but I stayed alert, my keys clutched tightly in my hand. As I got closer to my car, I made sure to give the van a wide berth, keeping as much distance between me and the man as possible. My heart was racing, and I was trying to stay calm, but every instinct in my body was telling me to get out of there fast. Just as I was about to reach my car, the man turned around. His face was gaunt, and he had this strange, unsettling look in his eyes. He didn't say anything, he just stared at me, his eyes following me as I walked past. I forced myself to keep moving, not wanting to make eye contact, but I could feel him watching me. As I unlocked my car and opened the door, I glanced back over my shoulder. The man was now walking toward me. My heart leapt into my throat, and I quickly jumped into my car, locking the doors behind me. My hands were shaking as I fumbled to start the engine, my mind racing. What did this guy want? Was he going to try to get into my car? Just as I started the car, the man reached my passenger side window. He didn't try to open the door, but he stood there, staring at me through the glass, his face only inches away. I could see him clearly now. His eyes were wide, his expression almost blank, but there was something menacing in the way he was just standing there. He didn't say a word. He didn't move. He just stood there, watching me, as if he was waiting for me to do something. I slammed the car into reverse, backing out of the parking space as fast as I could. As I pulled away, the man finally moved, stepping back toward the van. He didn't chase after me, but he didn't leave either. He just stood there, watching as I sped out of the parking lot. I didn't stop driving until I reached my apartment. My heart was still racing, and my hands were shaking as I parked and ran inside, locking the door behind me. I felt sick, like I had just narrowly escaped something terrible. I sat there for a while, trying to calm down, my mind replaying the whole encounter. I couldn't shake the feeling that the man had been waiting for someone to come back to their car, maybe not me specifically, but someone. And the way he just stood there, staring, made me feel like he had been planning something. I never went back to that grocery store at night again, and for weeks after that, I was paranoid every time I had to go out alone. I kept thinking about that van, the way it was parked, the way the man had just waited outside, like he was expecting someone. To this day, I still wonder what would have happened if I had hesitated for just a moment longer. What if I hadn't noticed him in time? What if he had gotten to my car before I did? So, to the man in the parking lot with the van, let's not meet. Dot. 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 This happened a few years ago when I was working the night shift at a small 24-hour convenience store. I just started working there after moving to a new town for college. It wasn't a bad gig, quiet, mostly empty during my shifts, and it gave me plenty of time to study between customers. The store was located on the edge of town, not far from a highway, so we'd get the occasional late-night traveler or trucker stopping by, but it was mostly locals. I'd been working there for a few months, and by then, I had settled into a routine. The night shifts were long and boring, but they were peaceful. I didn't mind them. The town was pretty quiet at night, and I usually felt safe, even though I was often the only person working. One night, though, everything changed. It was a Friday night, and my shift started around 10 p.m. The first few hours were uneventful, just the usual trickle of customers grabbing snacks or gas. Around 1 a.m., the store was completely empty, and I was sitting behind the counter, reading a book, when the bell above the door chimed. I looked up to see a man walk in. At first glance, he didn't seem too out of place, just a little disheveled, wearing a heavy coat even though it was warm out, and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He had that tired, road-worn look I'd seen on a lot of truckers who passed through late at night. I smiled politely and said, "Good evening." He didn't respond. Instead, he walked slowly toward the back of the store, his hands shoved into the pockets of his coat. I watched him out of the corner of my eye, feeling a little uneasy. Something about him felt off. He was moving too slowly, almost like he was stalling or waiting for something. He wandered through the aisles for a while, not picking anything up, just pacing back and forth. At this point, I was definitely getting a weird vibe from him. Most people come in, grab what they need, and leave, but this guy didn't seem interested in anything on the shelves. He just kept walking around, his eyes occasionally darting toward me. After a few minutes, he finally grabbed a bottle of water and made his way to the counter. I tried to stay calm, telling myself I was just being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He placed the water on the counter and stared at me for a moment before speaking. "You here all by yourself?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. That's when my stomach dropped. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to be careful. I forced a smile and shook my head. "No, my coworker's in the back," I lied. He'll be out in a minute. The man's eyes narrowed slightly, and he didn't say anything for a moment. Then, without another word, he pulled out a crumpled $5 bill and handed it to me. I quickly rang him up, my heart pounding in my chest. As I handed him his change, he leaned in closer to the counter, his eyes locked on mine. "You sure about that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me. I didn't know what this guy wanted, but it was clear he wasn't just here for a bottle of water. My hands were shaking as I quickly bagged his drink and slid it across the counter. "Yep," I said, trying to sound casual. "He'll be out any second." The man stared at me for a few more seconds, his gaze intense and unsettling. Finally, he grabbed the bottle of water, gave me a strange smile, and walked out of the store without saying another word. I stood there for a few minutes, my heart racing, trying to process what had just happened. Something about that interaction had shaken me to my core. I kept telling myself that I was just overreacting, that maybe he was just a weird guy passing through, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. I walked over to the door and locked it, a rare move during my shift. We were supposed to stay open 24/7, but at that moment, I didn't care. I wasn't going to risk anything. I went back behind the counter, my mind racing. I was debating whether I should call my boss or wait it out when I heard the faint sound of footsteps just outside the store. My blood ran cold. The man hadn't left. I turned off the lights inside the store, trying to make it look like the place was closed, and crouched behind the counter, barely breathing. The footsteps were getting closer, slow and deliberate, like someone was circling the building. I could hear them moving from the front of the store to the side, then back again. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my hands shaking so badly I could barely type the numbers. I whispered to the operator that someone was outside the store, and they promised to send an officer over as soon as possible. The minutes felt like hours as I sat there, huddled behind the counter, listening to the footsteps outside. I kept expecting the man to try the door or peer through the windows, but he never did. He just kept walking around the store, back and forth, like he was waiting for something. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw the flashing lights of a police car pull into the parking lot. The footsteps stopped, and everything went eerily quiet. I peeked over the counter just in time to see the man slip away into the shadows, disappearing behind the building. The officer came in, and I told him everything that had happened. He took a quick look around the property, but the man was long gone. He told me I'd done the right thing by locking the door and calling them, but there wasn't much else they could do at that point. I stayed behind the counter for the rest of my shift, the door locked and the lights off, waiting for the morning shift to come and relieve me. Every little sound made me jump, and I couldn't stop thinking about that man, about the way he'd watched me, the way he'd asked if I was alone, and the footsteps circling the building. I never worked the night shift again after that. I asked my boss to switch me to the daytime, and thankfully, he agreed. I don't know what that man wanted or what would have happened if I hadn't locked the door, but I'm just grateful I didn't have to find out. So, to the creepy man who came into the store that night, let's not meet. This happened when I was 17 years old, and it still gives me nightmares. My family used to rent a cabin every summer near a small lake in the woods, and it was something we always looked forward to. The cabin was isolated, no neighbors, no cell phone service, just us and nature. It was the perfect place to disconnect and relax for a week. That year, I decided to invite my two best friends, Sarah and Emily, to join us for the week. They were both excited, and we spent most of our time swimming, hiking, and just hanging out by the fire. Everything was going great until the fourth night, when things took a turn for the worse. We had spent the day hiking a nearby trail, and by the time we got back to the cabin, we were exhausted. My parents decided to head into town for the evening to grab some groceries, and they left me and my friends at the cabin. The sun was setting, and we thought it would be fun to have a fire and roast marshmallows while we waited for my parents to get back. We got the fire going and sat around, talking and laughing, when Emily suddenly froze, staring into the woods behind the cabin. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah and I both went quiet, listening. For a moment, all I could hear was the crackling of the fire and the distant sound of the wind rustling through the trees. "I didn't hear anything," I said, trying to sound casual, though I was starting to feel uneasy. Emily shook her head. No, I swear I heard something. Like footsteps. We sat in silence for a few more seconds, but there was nothing. I told myself it was just Emily's imagination and tried to brush it off. But then we heard it too. A soft, rhythmic crunching sound coming from the woods, like someone was walking on the dry leaves just beyond the tree line. It was faint, but it was definitely there, and it was getting closer. Sarah grabbed my arm, her eyes wide with fear. What is that? I stood up, peering into the darkness, but the firelight didn't reach far enough to see anything beyond the clearing. My heart was pounding, and I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, everything was completely silent again. We all sat there, holding our breath, waiting for something to happen. And then, from somewhere in the darkness, we heard it. A man's voice. I see you. The words were slow, deliberate, and dripping with menace. My blood ran cold. We looked at each other, panic setting in, and scrambled to put out the fire. We doused it with water, plunging the clearing into near-total darkness, save for the faint glow of the moon. We sat there for a few minutes, huddled together, trying to listen for any sign of movement. The footsteps had stopped, but the voice still echoed in my head. Who was out there? Why were they watching us? I think we should go inside, Sarah whispered, her voice shaky. I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. We grabbed our things and hurried back to the cabin, locking the door behind us. We sat in the living room, every light in the cabin turned on, trying to stay calm, but every little sound outside made us jump. For the next hour, we sat in tense silence, listening to the creaks of the old cabin and the occasional rustling of the wind outside. I kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching us from the darkness. And then, just as we were starting to calm down, there was a knock at the door. We all froze. The knock was soft, almost polite, but it sent a wave of fear through me. I stood up slowly, moving toward the door, but Sarah grabbed my arm, shaking her head. Don't open it, she whispered, her voice trembling. Please, don't open it. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Whoever was out there hadn't said anything, they had just knocked once and then gone silent. I leaned against the door, trying to listen for any sign of movement, but everything was quiet. My heart was racing, my mind spinning with 100 different terrifying possibilities. After what felt like an eternity, I stepped back from the door, my hands shaking. I'm not opening it. We backed away from the door and sat on the couch, huddled together, too scared to move. The minutes dragged on, and we didn't hear anything else, no footsteps, no voices, just the eerie silence of the woods outside. About an hour later, my parents finally returned. We ran to the door, throwing it open, relief flooding over us when we saw their car pulling into the driveway. We didn't waste any time telling them what had happened, but when my dad went outside to check around the cabin, he didn't find anything. No signs of anyone being there, no footprints, nothing. I wanted to believe it was all just in our heads, that maybe we had scared ourselves with the thought of being alone in the woods, but the voice, those 3 words, still haunt me. We ended up leaving the cabin the next day, cutting the trip short. None of us wanted to stay there after that night. My friends and I didn't talk about it much afterward, but every once in a while, Sarah will bring it up, and we'll exchange nervous glances, wondering what could have happened if we'd opened the door. To this day, I have no idea who was out there in the woods, watching us, but I'm grateful we didn't stick around to find out. So, to the man in the woods who said he saw us, let's not meet. Dot. 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 A few years ago, when I was in college, I picked up house-sitting jobs to make some extra money. It was an easy gig, mostly just watching over homes while people were on vacation, watering plants, and taking care of pets. I usually did it for families I knew through friends or my professors, so I never really felt unsafe. That is, until one particular job that still makes my skin crawl. One of my professors, Dr. Stevens, was going on a 2-week vacation with his family, and he asked if I'd be interested in watching their house and taking care of their dog, Max. I had been to his house once before for a class dinner, and it was a beautiful place, a big, old house on the edge of town, surrounded by woods. It seemed like an easy enough job, and the pay was good, so I agreed. The first few days were uneventful. Max was an easygoing dog, and I spent most of my time studying, watching TV, and taking walks in the woods with him. The house was quiet, a little too quiet at times, but I didn't mind. I enjoyed the solitude. It wasn't until the fourth night that things started to feel strange. It was a little after midnight, and I was getting ready for bed when I heard something outside. At first, I thought it was just Max moving around, but then I realized he was lying at the foot of the bed, sound asleep. The sound was coming from outside the window, soft, but unmistakable. It sounded like footsteps. I froze, listening intently, but the sound stopped as soon as I focused on it. I told myself it was probably just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer, and tried to brush it off. But I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that settled in my stomach. The next day, everything seemed normal again. I took Max for a walk, did some studying, and tried to forget about the strange noise from the night before. But as the sun started to set, that uneasy feeling crept back in. By the time night fell, I was on edge. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but I couldn't put my finger on what. The house felt different, like there was something lurking in the shadows just beyond my sight. I tried to distract myself by watching TV, but every little creak or groan of the house made me jump. It didn't help that the house was old and made plenty of noises on its own, floorboards creaking, pipes groaning, the wind rattling the windows. But there was one sound I couldn't ignore. Around 11 p.m., I heard footsteps again, coming from outside the house. This time, they were more distinct, slow, deliberate footsteps crunching through the gravel driveway. My heart started to race as I turned off the TV and strained to listen. Max, who had been lying beside me on the couch, suddenly perked up, his ears standing straight. He stared at the front door, his body tense, and let out a low growl. I grabbed my phone and crept over to the window, carefully pulling the curtain aside just enough to peek outside. There was someone standing at the end of the driveway. It was hard to make out in the darkness, but I could see the outline of a person, a man, standing still, just outside the reach of the porch light. He wasn't moving, wasn't making any sound, just standing there, staring at the house. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I felt a wave of panic wash over me. I didn't know what to do. Should I call the police? Was it just someone passing through? Maybe a neighbor? I watched for what felt like an eternity, but the man didn't move. He just stood there, motionless, like he was waiting for something. Max was growling low in his throat, his eyes locked on the front door. After a few minutes, the man turned and walked back down the driveway, disappearing into the woods that surrounded the house. I stood there for a while, staring out the window, trying to calm my racing heart. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was just someone who had taken a wrong turn or a local who was walking through the area. I considered calling Dr. Stevens, but I didn't want to freak him out or make it seem like I couldn't handle the job. So I didn't say anything. That night, I made sure all the doors and windows were locked before I went to bed. I kept the lights on in the living room and tried to stay calm, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching the house. Around midnight, just as I was about to fall asleep, I heard it again. Footsteps. This time, they were closer, coming from just outside the house. My heart started racing again as I sat up in bed, listening. Max was already on high alert, standing by the bedroom door, growling softly. I grabbed my phone and crept over to the window, just like the night before. I didn't want to look, but I had to know. There, standing on the porch, was the same man. He was closer this time, standing right in front of the door, his face obscured by the shadows. He didn't knock, didn't try to open the door, he just stood there, staring at the house. I backed away from the window, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to do. Should I call the police? What if he tried to break in? As I stood there, frozen with fear, I heard a soft scraping sound like something being dragged across the door. That was it. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my hands shaking. The operator answered, and I quickly explained what was happening, my voice trembling. "We're sending someone out," she said calmly. "Stay on the line." I crouched behind the couch, my heart racing, listening to the scraping sound at the door. Max was growling, his eyes locked on the front door, ready to attack if anyone came inside. After what felt like an eternity, I saw the flashing lights of a police car pulling into the driveway. The scraping stopped, and everything went quiet. I heard footsteps retreating down the porch steps, and when I peeked out the window again, the man was gone. The police searched the area, but they didn't find anyone. They assured me they'd patrol the neighborhood for the rest of the night and suggested I keep the doors locked and stay inside. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I called Dr. Stevens and told him everything that had happened. He was concerned, but he didn't know who it could have been. He told me that no one else was supposed to be near the house, and the neighbors were all miles away. I ended up finishing the house-sitting job, but I was on edge the entire time. Every night, I kept the lights on and stayed in the bedroom with Max by my side, listening for any signs of movement outside. Thankfully, the man never came back. To this day, I don't know who he was or what he wanted, but the thought of him standing there, night after night, watching the house, still haunts me. I haven't house-sat for anyone since. So, to the man who came to the house and scraped at the door, let's not meet. This story still gives me chills every time I think about it, and it's the main reason why I always double-check my surroundings whenever I'm out alone, especially at night. A few years ago, I was working late shifts at a restaurant in a busy city. It wasn't unusual for me to leave work around midnight or even later. The commute home took about 25 minutes, and since it was late, the streets were usually pretty empty by the time I headed home. One night, after an especially long and exhausting shift, I got in my car and started the drive home. It was just after 1 a.m., and I was dead tired. All I wanted to do was get home, take a quick shower, and crash into bed. The roads were dark, with only the occasional streetlight illuminating my path. The entire city seemed to be asleep. I turned onto a quieter stretch of road that I often took as a shortcut to avoid traffic lights. It was a longer but faster route, and since I just wanted to get home, I decided to take it. There were no other cars in sight, and I was driving on autopilot, barely paying attention to anything except the road in front of me. That's when I noticed it. In my rearview mirror, I saw headlights appear in the distance. At first, I didn't think much of it, just another late-night driver. But as I kept driving, I realized the car behind me was getting closer. A lot closer. I brushed it off as nothing at first, thinking they just wanted to pass, but the closer they got, the more uneasy I felt. Something about the way they were driving was off. They weren't speeding past me or trying to get around me like most impatient drivers would. Instead, they stayed directly behind me, their headlights bright in my rearview mirror, following my every move. I felt a chill run down my spine. I kept glancing up at the mirror, trying to stay calm, but my heart started to race. The car was too close, almost tailgating me, and no matter how fast or slow I went, they matched my speed perfectly. I was driving on a long, empty road with no intersections or turns for miles, and the fact that this car was sticking so close to me made my stomach churn. I sped up slightly, hoping to put some distance between us, but the car sped up too, staying right behind me. I could feel the panic rising in my chest as I gripped the steering wheel tighter, trying to figure out what to do. There was a gas station coming up on the right, a small, dimly lit place that was open 24/7. I decided to pull in, thinking that maybe if I stopped, they would just keep driving. My heart was pounding as I signaled and turned into the gas station. But the car followed me. I parked near the entrance, under the bright lights, and turned off my engine, watching the car closely through the rearview mirror. Instead of pulling up to one of the pumps, the car parked in the far corner of the lot, just sitting there with the headlights still on. I felt a wave of fear wash over me. Something was wrong. I tried to tell myself that it was just a coincidence, that maybe the driver was just stopping for gas, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching me. My instincts were screaming at me to get out of there, but I was frozen in my seat, unsure of what to do next. After what felt like forever, I finally gathered the courage to get out of my car. I walked into the gas station, trying to stay calm, but my hands were shaking. The attendant behind the counter looked up as I came in, and I quickly explained the situation to him, how the car had been following me, how they had pulled into the lot right after I did. He frowned and glanced out the window, his expression turning serious. "You should probably stay in here for a bit," he said, his voice low. "I'll keep an eye on the cameras." I nodded, feeling a little safer inside the store but still rattled. I stood near the counter, pretending to browse the snacks while keeping an eye on the car through the windows. It was still parked in the corner of the lot, the headlights on, but I couldn't see who was inside. After a few minutes, the gas station attendant spoke up. "They're still just sitting there. Do you want me to call the police?" I hesitated for a moment. I didn't want to overreact if it was nothing, but my gut was telling me that this wasn't normal. Before I could answer, the car's headlights suddenly turned off. The attendant and I both turned to look out the window as the car's driver's side door opened. A man stepped out, tall and wearing a dark hoodie with the hood pulled low over his face. He stood there for a moment, staring at the gas station, before slowly starting to walk toward the entrance. I felt my heart leap into my throat. The attendant immediately grabbed the phone and dialed 911, his eyes never leaving the man as he walked across the lot. I backed away from the window, my pulse racing. The man's walk was slow, deliberate, like he had all the time in the world. He wasn't in a rush, he knew I was inside, and that was enough for him. Just as he reached the door, the gas station's automatic doors slid open. The man stopped for a second, staring inside, before stepping in. He didn't say a word, just stood there, his face hidden under the hood, his eyes locked on me. The tension in the air was suffocating. The attendant, still on the phone with the police, motioned for me to stay behind the counter. I did, my body trembling as I watched the man take a few slow steps further into the store. "Can I help you?" the attendant asked, his voice calm but firm. The man didn't respond. He just stood there, staring at me, the air around him thick with menace. I could feel my skin crawling under his gaze. I didn't know what he wanted, but I knew it wasn't good. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he finally spoke. "I was just following her." His voice was low and cold, sending a shiver down my spine. The way he said it, so casually, like it was the most normal thing in the world, made my blood run cold. The attendant was still on the phone with the police, and he quickly gave them the description of the man. The man stood there for another moment, staring at me, before he finally turned and walked out of the store. He didn't look back. He just walked back to his car, got in, and drove away. The police arrived a few minutes later, but by then, the man was long gone. I gave them a description of the car and the man, but there wasn't much they could do. They took down my information and told me to be careful, but that was about it. I didn't drive home right away. I stayed in the gas station for a while, trying to calm down. The attendant was kind enough to keep me company until I felt safe enough to leave. When I finally did get back on the road, I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see those headlights behind me again. Thankfully, I never saw the man or his car again. But to this day, I still get anxious whenever I'm driving alone at night. I can't help but glance in my rearview mirror, always on edge, always wondering if someone's following me. So, to the man in the rearview mirror, the one who followed me that night, let's not meet. Dot. 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 This happened about 5 years ago when I was camping with a few friends. We had always been the outdoorsy type, and we loved spending weekends hiking, fishing, and camping at remote spots away from the usual crowded campgrounds. But after this particular trip, I've been a lot more hesitant about heading into the wilderness, especially when we're far from civilization. It was early fall, and my two friends, Tom and Chris, and I had planned a weekend camping trip to a spot we'd heard about from some other hikers. It was deep in the woods, about a 3-hour hike from where we parked, and supposedly not many people knew about it. The perfect spot to escape and enjoy some peace and quiet. We packed up our gear, food, and tents and hiked out to the site early on a Saturday morning. The trail was narrow and a bit overgrown, which gave us the sense that not a lot of people came out this way. The hike itself was beautiful, winding through dense trees, crossing small streams, and eventually leading to a secluded clearing near a lake. It was the perfect spot, surrounded by forest, with a clear view of the lake and not a single person in sight. We spent the day setting up camp, fishing, and exploring the area. As the sun began to set, we built a fire, cooked some dinner, and settled in for a night of telling stories and enjoying the tranquility of the woods. It was shaping up to be the perfect trip. Around 10 p.m., we were all getting ready to call it a night. The fire was dying down, and we were starting to feel the chill of the evening air. I was in my tent, lying in my sleeping bag, listening to the sounds of the forest, when I heard something faint at first, but distinct. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere just beyond the tree line. I sat up, straining to listen. For a moment, I thought it was just one of my friends moving around outside, but then I heard Tom call out from his tent, "Did you hear that?" Chris responded from his tent, his voice uneasy. "Yeah, what is that?" By this point, we were all wide awake. The footsteps were getting closer, but they didn't sound like an animal. They were too slow, too deliberate. It was as if someone was walking around the perimeter of our campsite, just out of sight. I unzipped my tent and stepped outside, my flashlight in hand. Tom and Chris did the same, all of us standing in the center of the campsite, shining our lights toward the trees. The footsteps had stopped, and the forest was eerily quiet, too quiet. We stood there for a few minutes, scanning the darkness, but we couldn't see anything beyond the glow of our flashlights. "Maybe it's a deer," I suggested, though I didn't really believe that. Tom shook his head. "No way. That sounded like a person." We decided to sit by the fire for a bit longer, just in case. We stoked the fire back up, and the three of us sat there, trying to brush off the strange feeling of being watched. The forest remained silent, and after a while, we convinced ourselves that whatever we heard was just our imagination or some animal passing by. Eventually, we all went back to our tents, though none of us were feeling as relaxed as we had earlier. I must have fallen asleep at some point, but I woke up to the sound of something outside my tent. It was the unmistakable sound of footsteps again, closer this time. I could hear the soft crunch of leaves and twigs underfoot, moving slowly around the campsite. I held my breath, listening, my heart pounding in my chest. It was definitely someone or something walking around out there. I heard Chris whisper from his tent. "Guys, are you hearing this?" "Yeah," I whispered back, my voice shaky. "What should we do?" Before anyone could answer, we heard a low, raspy voice coming from the darkness. "You shouldn't be here." My blood ran cold. The voice was quiet but clear, and it came from somewhere just beyond the fire pit, hidden in the shadows. We all froze, too scared to move, too scared to breathe. "You need to leave," the voice said again, this time louder, more insistent. I glanced at Tom and Chris, both of them wide-eyed with fear. We had no idea who was out there, or how many of them there were, but it was clear that whoever it was, they didn't want us here. Tom stood up slowly, holding his flashlight like a weapon. "Who's out there?" he called, his voice trembling. There was no response. For a moment, everything was silent again, and then, without warning, we heard footsteps running through the trees, fast, heavy footsteps, like someone was sprinting away from the campsite. We stood there, listening as the sound faded into the distance, until all we could hear was the crackling of the fire. "What the hell was that?" Chris whispered, his voice shaking. "I don't know," I replied, still in shock. "But I think we need to leave." None of us wanted to stay another minute in that clearing. We quickly packed up our gear, throwing everything into our backpacks as fast as we could. We didn't bother taking down the tents properly, we just stuffed them into our bags, eager to get out of there. As we started hiking back toward the car, we kept our flashlights on, constantly scanning the woods around us. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, made us jump. My heart was pounding the entire time, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching us from the darkness. We finally made it back to the car just as the sun was starting to rise. None of us said much during the drive home, still rattled by what had happened. We couldn't stop thinking about that voice, and the way it had seemed to come out of nowhere, warning us to leave. To this day, we still don't know who or what was out there that night. But after that experience, I haven't been back to that campsite, and I've become a lot more cautious about where I go camping, especially when it's far from other people. So, to the person in the woods who told us to leave, let's not meet.